5 grueling years, $2 million vaporized, 17 top-tier technical experts flown in from 3 different continents, and Evelyn's Ferrari still sat in the garage like an unsolvable equation, cold, silent, untouchable. Not a single person on this earth could explain why that legendary engine refused to fire up. Not a single spark, not a single growl, not a single breath of life had escaped from beneath that hood since the day she inherited it. The following content is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, events, or locations is purely coincidental. Thank you for choosing to listen. We hope you enjoy the story and have a pleasant experience. Until one afternoon, when Evelyn's patience reached its absolute limit. She spun around, marched across the polished garage floor, straight toward the man holding a mop in the corner, and ground out every word. "What about you? Do you dare to try?" No one in that room knew what kind of madness was about to unfold, and the story behind this Ferrari is a secret you won't believe until you hear it for yourself. Meridian Motor Works occupied the ground floor of a renovated industrial complex on the west side of Los Angeles. It looked nothing like the grimy, oil-stained repair shops most people pictured. The floors here were polished to a mirror finish. The lighting was cold and precise down to the millimeter. The air carried the faint, mingling scent of expensive leather and premium machine oil. Every vehicle that rolled through these doors was treated like a masterpiece in a museum, rather than just a machine. Clients paid for that regal atmosphere just as much as they paid for the repairs. It was the kind of place where people brought things they simply could not bear to lose. And it was also the place where Evelyn faithfully appeared every Monday morning without fail. She didn't come to manage anyone or hand out orders, but simply to stand in silence beside a car she hadn't been able to start for 5 years. She would stand there, feeling something invisible for a few fleeting minutes, before turning her back and returning to the relentless grind of her reality. Evelyn, 41 years old, ran Holloway & Crane, one of the most prestigious architectural design firms on the West Coast. In any room she entered, Evelyn was always the first to speak, the most decisive, and the one who walked out knowing more than when she came in. She was not the type of woman to let problems linger out of her control. Her words were sharp, her decisions ruthless. She possessed an iron discipline when it came to drawing the line between what she felt and what she chose to reveal. Those qualities had built her entire empire, except for one thing against which all her power was utterly useless. The 1963 Ferrari 250 GTO had belonged to her father. It was one of fewer than 40 remaining in the entire world. The paint was Rosso Corsa, a red so deep and peculiar that it seemed to shift shades depending on how the light struck it. The chrome along the air vents had dulled slightly over the decades. The interior leather possessed a distinct softness, the mark of something that had been touched and loved for a very long time before being left behind. Her father had passed away 5 years ago. The car was delivered to Meridian on a flatbed tow truck late that autumn, and from that very first day, it had never once started. Evelyn had no passion for cars. She couldn't care less about racing engineering or anything that ran on fuel. But this car was a primal, singular exception. It was the last thread on earth that connected her to the man who had raised her. Her father had been a deeply private person in the way men of his generation often were. Not cold, not absent, but contained. He expressed his love through presence and action rather than empty words. He rarely mentioned the Ferrari, but on the rare occasions he did, those brief words etched themselves into her mind. Once he told her the car had been with him for a very long journey. Another time he said it meant something to him in a way he couldn't fully explain. She hadn't pushed for answers. Children always assume they have a lifetime to figure things out. But time waits for no one. Now the car sat motionless in Bay 4 at Meridian. On that Monday morning in late October, Evelyn stood beside it longer than usual. She rested her hand on the roof, feeling the chill of the metal seep into her skin. What she truly craved, if she allowed herself a moment of vulnerability, was to hear that engine. Just once. Her father once described that sound as the one thing that made him feel most alive in this world. She wanted to know what he had felt. She wanted to be there when it roared. But then she turned and walked out into the pale morning light, leaving the Ferrari exactly as it always was, flawless, silent, and completely unreachable. The Ferrari's diagnostic file was so thick it looked like a legal brief. Evelyn had read every page so many times she could recite paragraphs from memory without opening it. The pathetic chain of failures had begun just weeks after the car's arrival. Cameron Meridian's lead technician ran the first diagnostics. The 47-year-old broad-shouldered mechanic wore his 2 decades of experience with vintage European cars like an expensive piece of jewelry, flashy and arrogant. He had worked on Maseratis, Alfa Romeos, and dozens of historic Ferraris. When he first examined the 250 GTO, he confidently declared he'd have it running in a week. He didn't finish in a week. He didn't finish at all. 3 detailed diagnostic reports over the next month produced professionally formatted, meticulous documents that offered absolutely no conclusion. He always had theories that led nowhere. Over the next 5 years, Evelyn had flown in 3 Ferrari experts directly from Maranello, Italy, costing over $400,000 in travel and consultation fees. Hired 2 German engineers who had spent their lives restoring racing engines, bleeding another $60,000 just to have them replace 4 components that were never broken to begin with. Brought in a British restoration team of 7 technicians who worked for 6 weeks, replaced 15 parts, and left empty-handed. Consulted a retired American engineer who had restored cars for the Geneva Museum. He looked at it for 4 days, asked for 2 more to think, and politely declined to continue. The biggest single expense was Adrian. Evelyn flew to Rome specifically to meet him. He was rumored in the restoration world to be the only living man who had resurrected 3 250 GTOs from the dead. Adrian, in his 50s and softly spoken, was a true titan in his field. He arrived with 2 assistants and specialized equipment that had to be shipped in separate crates. Adrian spent 3 grueling months on the car. In the end, he submitted a 50-page technical report filled with cross-analyses and metrics. The report concluded with a short paragraph that was essentially a bitter confession. He had no idea what he was dealing with. His fee was $250,000. The total amount of money Evelyn had poured into this silent block of metal was inching toward $2 million. But what truly drove people to the brink of madness wasn't the time or the money. It was the fact that every single expert arrived at the exact same ridiculous conclusion. The car was in perfect condition. Every component was precise. Every electrical circuit was intact. Every fuel line was clean. Every mechanical system passed the spec tests with flying colors. There was no diagnosable flaw on this Ferrari. It simply refused to start. It was as if the car had a soul and had made a conscious decision to reject the world, and no amount of wealth or expertise could negotiate with it. Cameron's latest conspiracy theory, delivered in the tone of a man desperate to protect his ego rather than fix the issue, was that there was a residual calibration error in the ignition system. He immediately admitted this made no sense for a car built in 1963, long before programmable systems existed. He only said it because he needed something to say. Evelyn had stopped listening to his nonsense 18 months ago. What haunted her wasn't exactly disappointment. It was an overwhelming intuition that everyone who had touched this car was asking the wrong questions, that the answer was hiding somewhere inside it, patient and still, and no one had been calm enough to find it. Isaac had been working at Meridian for 3 months when the turning point came. He was hired through a third-party staffing agency for cleaning and maintenance. His file showed 0 experience in the automotive industry. It only listed general labor jobs and an address in a part of the city where people rarely achieved prestigious careers. Isaac was 38, lean, with a face so unreadable it was easily forgotten. Wearing the gray uniform of the cleaning staff, he moved through the garage with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that invisibility is its own form of freedom. He was always on time. He worked without drawing attention. By the end of his 3rd week, not a single person at Meridian had had a meaningful conversation with him. But if anyone had been observant enough, they would have noticed something distinct about his hands. Those were not the hands of a man whose only manual labor was pushing a mop across smooth floors. The calluses were in the wrong places, or rather, they were in highly specific places, the kind of calluses that only form after years of gripping precision mechanical tools. His knuckles bore old scars from detailed, intricate work, and no matter how hard he scrubbed, there was a faint stain of machine oil at the base of his fingernails, absorbed too deeply into the skin to ever fully wash away. Grace, the receptionist, had noticed this early on, but she chose to stay quiet. Everyone carries a past that is no one else's business. But what Grace had noticed more recently was how Isaac behaved around the Ferrari. It wasn't blatant, but it was consistent. Whenever his cleaning route took him past Bay 4, he would pause just a fraction longer than necessary. He didn't stare like a curious onlooker. It was just a momentary stillness before moving on, and his angle of observation was unlike anyone else's. He didn't look at the hood like a speed junkie or at the sculpted curves like an admirer of beauty. He looked at the rear wheel arch. He looked at the undercarriage from a low, oblique angle. He stared at the intersection between the chassis rail and the engine firewall. Those were areas that only mattered to someone thinking about how the car was built, not how it looked. 2 weeks before that fateful afternoon, Cameron carelessly left a technical drawing on a workbench, a detailed cross-section of an early 1960s V12 engine. As Isaac was cleaning nearby, he picked it up to move it aside. He held it for exactly 13 seconds before setting it down. Grace watched from across the room and counted in her head. The drawing had initially been placed upside down. Isaac had flipped it right side up without a second thought, an automatic reflex of someone for whom reading complex mechanical blueprints was as natural as reading a sentence from left to right. Isaac had arrived in Los Angeles 6 months earlier from Turin in northern Italy. What he had been doing in Turin and what drove him halfway across the world just to be a janitor at a luxury auto shop were questions no one at Meridian bothered to ask. In another world, if you knew exactly where to listen, the name Isaac was still whispered among a small circle of retired classic car restoration engineers. It was spoken with a certain reverence, not loudly, not often, but with the heavy weight of regret, a brilliant mind that ended in tragedy. Depending on who was telling the story, that ending was either a catastrophic failure or a brutal punishment. His peers described it one way, his former superiors another. But both sides agreed on one undeniable fact. Isaac was a genius. Of course, no one at Meridian knew any of this. Isaac kept mopping floors, changing light bulbs, emptying trash. The Ferrari remained dead in Bay 4, and 5 years slowly dragged into 5 years and 3 months. The day everything imploded was a Friday afternoon in early November. Adrian called Evelyn via video. The call lasted exactly 11 minutes. He didn't call to report progress. He called because he felt a professional obligation to state a hard truth. The car's problem existed outside the boundaries of human comprehension. He was careful not to use the word hopeless out of pride, but the implication was heavy enough to make the floor drop out from under Evelyn. She hung up, placed her phone on the desk next to the Ferrari, and stood frozen. The cold afternoon light cascaded through the high windows, washing over the hood and turning the red paint into a dark, shadowy brown. Cameron strolled out from the back office. He claimed he was checking on a parts order, but his timing was no accident. He knew about the call, and he approached with the swagger of a man who had rehearsed his lines. He stood next to Evelyn, staring at the car, and finally spat out the words he had been holding back for almost a year. This car still has market value, even if it doesn't run. An auction would easily pull in over $1.5 million. There are collectors who will pay just for the pedigree. Sometimes knowing when to let go is the clearest sign of wisdom. He spoke with the calm cadence of a man offering rational advice, which only made it infinitely worse. Evelyn didn't even look at him. Her eyes remained locked on the car for another moment. Then she looked up, scanning the massive garage. In the distance, she saw Isaac slowly pushing his mop along the wall, unhurried, diligent as always. What happened next was entirely uncalculated. She was a woman who calculated everything, But the next 30 seconds were the eruption of 5 years of waiting, of exorbitant invoices, of polite excuses from the world's best experts, all boiling over into one catastrophic loss of control. The moment when the line between what a person can suppress and what they truly feel is completely obliterated. She snapped her head toward Cameron, her voice cutting like a scalpel. 5 years, $2 million, and it's still a pile of scrap. Then she pointed a finger straight across the room at Isaac. What about you? Do you know anything about cars? Do you dare to try? Or are you just going to take my money and vanish like the rest of them? Dead silence fell over the garage. Grace froze at the reception desk. Cameron's face twisted through a fleeting complex emotion before settling into a thin, condescending smirk. A silent display of absolute disgust. Isaac slowly leaned his mop against the wall. He looked straight at Evelyn. No hesitation, no wounded pride, just the calm, level gaze of a man who already knew exactly what he was going to say. 48 hours, he said. No assistant, no upfront budget. If I fail, you owe me absolutely nothing. Evelyn stared at him for a long time. Then, without entirely understanding why, she nodded. Isaac started at 7 p.m. that Friday. He demanded the garage be cleared out. Not because he needed privacy, but because he demanded absolute silence. Cameron left with visible reluctance, dragging his feet in a theatrical display of petty annoyance. Grace turned off the lobby lights and slipped out the side door. Evelyn stayed in her upstairs office, turning on the security camera feed. She watched him through the screen like someone observing a surgery they didn't understand entirely, unable to look away. For the first 20 minutes, Isaac didn't lay a finger on the car. He pulled up a stool a few feet away and sat down. He looked at the car the way a man looks at something he needs to understand before deciding how to approach it. Not analytical, but more like he was waiting for it to show him where to begin. Then he stood up, walked slowly around the vehicle twice, and stopped at the rear left corner. He crouched down, pressed his ear close to the bodywork without touching it, and rapped his knuckle against the exterior exactly once. He closed his eyes and listened. He shifted 6 inches to the right and knocked again. He moved to the passenger side and repeated this at 4 distinct points along the lower frame. He wasn't putting on a show for the camera. He had forgotten the camera even existed. What he did over the next few hours was radically different from any diagnostic protocol Cameron's team had run in 5 years. Isaac didn't use scanners. He moved around and underneath the car with intense, unhurried focus, like someone reading a document in a language they knew intimately but hadn't spoken in years. Meticulous, methodical, tracking clues that only he could see. He pulled a small notebook from the front pocket of his uniform. Not a tablet, not a smart device, just a frayed paper notebook crammed with old notes, and now he calmly added to them as the night wore on. Saturday morning. Cameron entered through the side door much earlier than necessary. He was there to watch, or rather to eagerly await, the janitor's humiliating defeat. By this time, Isaac had removed a small component assembly from the right side of the gearbox housing and set it on a cloth on the workbench. It was about the size of a fist, completely ordinary looking, pulled from a location that not a single expert had bothered to check in 5 years. Cameron sneered at the part, then glared at Isaac. That's the torque balance linkage. If you mess up the load distribution on that assembly, you're going to trigger cascading stress fractures through the entire drivetrain. Isaac remained bent over the gearbox, not even bothering to look up. I know what it is. This is exactly where I need to be. Cameron froze for a second, then muttered something under his breath and stomped to the back of the garage, pretending to busy himself. At 9 a.m., Grace brought down 2 cups of coffee. She set one down next to Isaac's notebook, which was splayed open on the edge of the workbench. Without meaning to pry, she caught sight of 2 lines on the open page. One was a string of measurements written in handwriting so tiny and perfectly spaced it looked typed. The second was a note in the margin written in slightly different ink, blending English and Italian. The problem is not in the engine. The problem is that no one has asked what the car is trying to say. Grace set the coffee down. She didn't tell a soul what she had read, but those words echoed in her mind for the rest of the day. By Saturday afternoon, Isaac's rhythm changed. He stopped searching and started verifying. He sat completely motionless in front of a specific section of the chassis near the firewall. His expression was that of a man who had unraveled the end of a mystery, spending one final quiet moment confirming a truth he already knew. On Sunday morning, Isaac asked to speak with Evelyn privately. Evelyn walked down to the garage at 8 a.m. wearing a dark blazer. Her face was locked in its usual tight control, the mask she wore when facing the unpredictable. Cameron was hovering near the door. Evelyn stopped giving him an icy stare that made it abundantly clear he had no part in this conversation. He stayed outside. On the workbench next to the Ferrari, Isaac had laid out 3 items. The small metal assembly from the gearbox, now scrubbed clean, its internal structure fully visible. His notebook opened to a specific page. A photograph. It was a small, black and white photo curling at the edges, printed on thick, vintage paper. Isaac had found it hidden deep inside the trunk lining, wrapped in an oil-soaked cloth, wedged into a seam that hadn't been touched since the last person sealed it away. He placed it in front of Evelyn without a word. The photo showed a man standing next to this exact Ferrari, undeniable because of a tiny unique blemish on the left front fender. The background looked like a European racetrack on a sunny day. In the bottom corner, penned in soft Italian cursive, Sempre tua. Milano, 1963. Always yours. Milan, 1963. The man in the photo was her father. He was younger than any memory she had of him, younger than any picture her family owned. He stood next to the car with an expression she had never, ever seen on his face. It wasn't pride. It was something infinitely deeper and more private. Looking at it through the fog of decades, it was the face of a man standing at the absolute radiant center of his own life. Evelyn stood paralyzed for a long time. When she finally looked up, Isaac began to explain. He spoke with the cadence of a man who had carefully weighed every syllable, committing to telling only the truth, with nothing added. "There is no mechanical flaw with this Ferrari. There never was," Isaac said calmly. "The reason it won't start isn't a broken part, a calibration error, or a factory defect. It's an intentional mechanism, a custom-built mechanical locking system integrated directly into the ignition sequence. It was installed by hand after the car left the factory, by an artisan working in absolute secrecy, leaving no documentation behind. This mechanism did not exist in any Ferrari manual. Modern diagnostic tools couldn't scan it because it didn't behave like an error. It behaved like a deliberate command. The car would only start if the driver knew the exact physical sequence of actions executed in perfect order to unlock it a code that was never written down, existing only in the mind of its creator and anyone he chose to pass it on to. Isaac pointed to a section of the metal assembly on the table. "This is the trigger point. It's not a standard lock or switch. Every expert who came here buried their heads in the engine, the electronics, the fuel pump. No one looked here because it doesn't look broken, because it isn't. It was designed this way, intentionally, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and wanted it to remain a secret forever." Evelyn forced out the question that had been suffocating her. "How do you know this?" Isaac stopped. It was the first time she had seen him hesitate in 2 days. Something flickered across his face, not quite emotion, not quite emptiness, but something trapped between the two. "Because I have seen this mechanism once before," he whispered, "in Turin, built by the exact same man." The garage fell dead silent. Outside, Cameron had crept closer to the door. Through the frosted glass, Evelyn could see his shadow leaning in, eavesdropping. She ignored him for now. Cameron shoved the door open, shooting Isaac a venomous glare, the look of a man stripped of his professional authority by someone he had never even considered a threat. "That's a very captivating story," Cameron sneered. "But you still haven't started the car." Isaac stared at him just long enough for the petty jealousy of the comment to hang awkwardly in the air, requiring no defense. Then he turned back to Evelyn. "I need another 24 hours, and I need you here when I'm done." That afternoon, Cameron made a phone call to Adrian. He hid behind the guise of professional courtesy to inform the expert of a new development. But in reality, Cameron's cowardly ego just wanted to pack the room with credentialed witnesses to watch an outcome he could neither take credit for nor deny. Adrian arrived the next morning. This time, no assistants, no heavy equipment crates, and devoid of the optimism he had on his first visit. He quietly listened as Cameron summarized Isaac's delusional discovery. Adrian's face remained perfectly neutral, the mask of an expert who had learned never to rush to judgment. When Cameron finished, Adrian pondered for a moment and asked just one question. Where is Isaac? Isaac was in the garage where he had been all night. At 11 p.m., Grace had brought him some food. He had thanked her distractedly, his mind so deeply entrenched in the work that he couldn't break away for basic pleasantries. At the doorway, Grace looked back. Under a single spotlight, Isaac was hunched over the gearbox, moving with the tranquil focus of a man who isn't racing the clock because he already knows exactly how the story ends. Evelyn didn't sleep a wink that night. She lay on the sofa in her upstairs office, her phone resting on her chest, staring blankly at the ceiling. Her mind was spiraling around the photograph, the Italian inscription, and the unfamiliar expression on the face of a father she thought she knew for 30 years. After midnight, she called Gerald Whitmore, the attorney who had served her father for 3 decades, and the only living person who might know something about his hidden years. The call was brief. After hanging up, she lay motionless for another 15 minutes. At 2 a.m., she went downstairs. She didn't turn on the lights, just stood quietly at the threshold, looking in. Isaac was still working relentlessly at the bench. He didn't look up. She left in silence, and long after, she would never be quite sure if he knew she had been standing there. At exactly 11 a.m. on Monday, Isaac appeared at the door of Evelyn's office. He looked like a man who had stayed awake for 3 straight days and still wasn't sure if the sacrifice was worth it, but his eyes were crystal clear. "Are you ready?" he asked. She had been ready since 2 a.m., though she kept that to herself. They walked down to the garage together. Cameron was already there, arms crossed beside the driver's side of the Ferrari, looking like a man who had prepped 2 different speeches and was waiting to see which one the situation would force him to deliver. Adrian stood near the passenger door, separated from the group, maintaining his stoic expression. Grace stood near the workbench, empty-handed, her eyes watching everything. Isaac walked to the passenger side and opened the door. He stood there for a moment, gazing into the interior, the leather, the dashboard, the steering wheel, like a man standing at the threshold of the past. Then he slowly lowered himself into the driver's seat. What he did next defied the expectations of everyone watching. He didn't immediately reach for the keys. First, he placed both hands on the steering wheel in highly unnatural positions, 10 o'clock and 7 o'clock. It wasn't the grip of a driver ready to drive, but the deliberate positioning of someone inputting a code. Next, he adjusted the seat backwards by a highly precise increment, stopping exactly when it locked into an invisible alignment. He reached up and adjusted the rear-view mirror without actually looking into it. Finally, he placed his left hand flat against the dashboard, held it there for a single breath, and pulled it back. Only then did he reach for the key. He turned it. The Ferrari 250 GTO started on the very first try. The sound that erupted from beneath the hood wasn't the labored wheeze of a machine violently shaken awake from a long hibernation. It exploded instantly, powerful, rich, absolute. A V12 engine reclaiming its roar after 5 years of silence, as if it had never stopped running at all, as if it had just been waiting for the one person who knew how to politely ask it to speak. The roar filled the entire garage, echoing off the polished concrete, bouncing off the high ceiling, and rattling the glass partitions. It was exactly the sound Evelyn's father had described. In that instant, she understood his words perfectly. It didn't sound like a lifeless machine. It sounded like a living, breathing entity. Evelyn took 2 steps forward before she even realized she was moving. She stopped at the driver's window, staring at Isaac. He wasn't looking at the crowd. His eyes were locked on the dashboard dials, his face calm and unreadable. And then Evelyn did something no one in the room expected. The iron-willed CEO dropped to one knee on the floor, bringing her eyes level with the door. She pressed her palm flat against the roof of the car and closed her eyes tight. No one made a sound. The engine purred smooth and arrogant. Grace clenched her fingers at her sides. Even Cameron, for one fleeting moment, was rooted to the spot. Isaac turned the key back. The engine died. He stepped out of the car. Cameron broke the silence first. His voice tried to project confidence, the awkward kind of confidence used to mask sheer panic. That sequence you just did, there isn't a single record of that anywhere. Where did you get it from? From the man who designed it, Isaac replied. And who was that? Someone who never wanted it written down. Cameron choked on his words for a second, then pivoted to the question he had been burning to ask all morning. Then let me ask you a simpler question. Who exactly are you? Isaac didn't look at Cameron. He shifted his gaze to Adrian. He held the eye contact for a carefully measured moment. In 2009, you were the technical supervisor for the Lusso restoration project in Turin, Isaac said. I was the lead engineer on that project. A shockwave ripped across Adrian's face, an involuntary, fleeting expression that was impossible to hide. His mouth parted slightly, then closed shut. Isaac turned to Evelyn. He spoke without rushing, without theatricality, as if unloading a heavy burden he had carried for far too long. He had spent 14 years of his youth working for Ferrari, serving as an expert in historic restoration and custom mechanical design. The artisan who had created this cipher lock, the man standing next to the Ferrari in the black and white photo, the one who penned Sempre Tua in the corner, was his mentor. The greatest mechanical mind he had ever encountered in his 14 years, surrounded by brilliance. And in his entire lifetime, that mentor had built exactly 2 of these locking mechanisms for 2 specific cars. Where is the other one? Evelyn asked softly. It was completely destroyed, Isaac answered. In a crash in 1971, Evelyn stood absolutely still. The information from her lawyer the night before dropped into her chest like a boulder finally finding its resting place. The puzzle pieces locked together flawlessly. Her father and the woman who died in the 1971 crash. She didn't say it out loud, not yet. Cameron tried to thrash around one last time. If you were a Ferrari engineer, what the hell are you doing here? He waved his hand dismissively at the garage at Isaac's gray uniform. Why is a guy with your resume pushing a broom? The question was laced with malice meant to humiliate Isaac, but it completely backfired. It hung in the air, exposing the narrow-minded, pathetic nature of the man who asked it. It was the loudest sound in the room and the most worthless. Isaac stared at Cameron just long enough for the contempt to sink in. Then he looked back at Evelyn. There is one question you haven't asked me yet, he said, but I think you already know the answer. Whenever you are ready, I will tell you. They sat in the small office at the back of the garage, just the 2 of them. The ambient noise of the afternoon settled outside. The Ferrari sat quietly behind the glass wall, but it was a completely different kind of silence than the last 5 years. It wasn't the stubborn silence of refusal. It was the peace of a soul that had finally been understood. Isaac told her everything, directly, raw, without embellishment, and without asking for an ounce of pity. 4 years ago, while working on an authentication project for historic racing cars at a massive European auction house, he uncovered severe anomalies in the paperwork. It was a massive fraud ring. Cars were being issued forged certificates of authenticity to be sold as originals. The scam involved millions of dollars over the course of 6 years. He reported his findings to his superiors. The report was reviewed, acknowledged, and then quietly buried. He submitted a second, more formal report. Within 30 days, he was fired for vague procedural violations that couldn't be traced. Within 60 days, his name was systematically scrubbed from every technical document, from every project he had poured his blood into for 14 years. The papers he wrote, the restorations he led, the certificates he signed, all reassigned to others, redacted or destroyed. He didn't sue. Industry insiders warned him that fighting such a powerful syndicate would strip him of everything he had left, and he would win absolutely nothing.
"I didn't lose my career because I was wrong," he said, his voice flat. "I lost my career because I was right." He fled to Los Angeles because he needed a place where no one knew the name Isaac, where no one attached a history to him. The janitorial job wasn't a punishment or a disguise. It was simply the only job available that didn't demand he hand over pieces of himself he wasn't willing to give. He had never planned for the Ferrari. The first day he walked into Meridian and saw the car in Bay 4, he instantly recognized the cipher lock. It was like recognizing the handwriting of the person who taught you how to write. He had no grand plan other than to stay and wait for the right moment to present itself. He didn't approach Evelyn. He didn't reveal his identity. He simply worked diligently, staying present, letting fate take its course. "I wanted to see if the car deserved the person keeping it," he confessed, "before I decided what to do."
Evelyn listened to all of it without interrupting once. When he finished, she looked down at her hands for a long moment.
The engine had roared.
The photo of her father was resting securely in her jacket pocket. The Italian inscription echoed in her mind like a code she had struggled to translate for years, only to finally understand it. She thought about the call with the lawyer last night, about that fateful year of 1963, about all the hollow years that had passed, until that Friday afternoon when she pointed at a janitor and spoke the truest words she had uttered in 5 years. "Do you dare to try? You achieved something that $2 million couldn't," she said, her voice like a whisper. Isaac replied instantly, "You owe me nothing." That afternoon, Cameron submitted his resignation via email. The wording was intensely professional, framing it as a mutually agreed transition, yet it didn't contain a single ounce of truth. Evelyn skimmed it once, forwarded it to HR, and didn't bother to reply. Adrian's departure was entirely different and far more human. He sought out Isaac in the garage late that afternoon. Isaac was carefully putting his tools away and cleaning the workbench, the unhurried demeanor of a man who had flawlessly completed a masterpiece. Adrian stopped a few feet away, enveloped in the hesitation of a man who wants to speak but isn't sure he has earned the right. Then he spoke in Italian quietly, with no audience. He confessed that he had seen Isaac's name on the Turin files and had heard the rumors that Isaac resigned voluntarily. He hadn't dug deeper because it wasn't his nature, but deep down he had carried a gnawing guilt over his own inaction for 4 years without fully understanding why, until this morning. Adrian held out his hand. Isaac took it. Not another word was spoken. Adrian turned on his heel, walked out the front doors, and never came back. Grace approached Isaac to ask about his future plans. She asked with the delicate tact of someone nurturing a hope but not wanting to pressure the listener. Isaac said he wasn't entirely sure yet, but for the first time his voice lacked that heavy, suffocating weight. It wasn't the answer of a man backed into a corner. It was the answer of a man standing before countless open doors after years of being locked out in no rush to choose just one. Evelyn gave strict orders to compile all technical data regarding the cipher lock, every note Isaac made, every measurement, every sequence step, and archive it as highly classified material in the Ferrari's file. Only she had the authorization to access it. The locking mechanism was reinstalled into the gearbox, fully functional and pristine. The photograph was rewrapped in the oilcloth and carefully tucked back into the exact same seam beneath the trunk lining. Some things are simply meant to stay exactly where they belong. A week later, Evelyn drove the Ferrari for the first time. Not on a crowded highway, not to show it off. She drove it to a massive empty dirt lot belonging to a riverside warehouse complex her firm was currently designing. A sprawling concrete expanse, silent and entirely isolated from the world. She drove slowly, both hands gripping the wheel. The engine growled beneath her, just as it had in the garage. Powerful, instantaneous, and brimming with life. She rolled to a stop at the edge of the lot and killed the engine. She sat quietly in the car for several minutes without getting out. The late afternoon sun hit the windshield and lingered there. Whatever emotions were washing over her face in those minutes, they belonged to her and her alone. When she finally turned the car around, Isaac was leaning against the warehouse wall. He hadn't been called. He just appeared the way he always did, silently, without fanfare, at the exact moment he was needed. He watched the car decelerate and stop. As Evelyn stepped out and walked toward him across the concrete, he could tell by her aura that whatever she needed to resolve inside that car, she had done it. She stopped a few feet from him. Silence hung between them.
"My firm has a vacant position," she finally spoke.
Technical Director of the Special Assets Preservation Division. It's not strictly limited to automotive. It's much broader. The core mission is to ensure that genuine heritage doesn't vanish just because the rest of the world isn't patient enough to understand it. She paused for a beat. That could be a job description or a statement of a different kind. I'm not entirely sure myself.
Isaac looked at her with his usual calm demeanor, a deep, observant attention.
"Are you making an offer or are you asking?" he said. "Both," she replied. The space between them settled, but it wasn't suffocating. It was the quietness between two people who had stripped away their hollow armor, who hadn't fully decided on their next step, but no longer felt the desperate need to rush it.
Isaac glanced over at the Ferrari, basking in the twilight.
The Rosso Corsa paint flared as it caught the dying rays of the sun, reflecting a completely different hue than it absorbed. Much like how certain things in this world eventually are finally allowed to just be what they always were. He turned back to Evelyn, and for the first time since that morning 3 months ago, when he walked into Meridian Motor Works in a gray uniform, carrying a soul crushed by secrets no one bothered to ask about, Isaac smiled. Not a polite customer service smile, not a forced smile to keep his distance. It was the smile of a man who had finally set down a massive burden after a long, agonizing journey, only to realize that his hands still possessed their true worth.